I almost cannot put into words how truly horrible the story that I'm about to tell you is. But I can tell you that I tried a tiny taste of what these pilots went through in the simulator,
and I am using everything that I have.
And it really scared me. This is the story of the second Boeing 737 MAX accident. Stay tuned. On the 29th of October 2018, a horrible accident took place in Indonesia, involving an almost brand new Boeing 737 MAX 8 from Lion Air. The aircraft disappeared from radar only minutes after departure, and the pilots had managed to transmit messages about having flight control problems before suddenly diving nose first into the Java Sea, killing everyone on board. I have just released an hour-long video explaining that crash in detail, and I highly recommend you to watch that one before this to fully appreciate the gravity of the story that I will now tell. During the weeks and months after the accident of Lion Air Flight 610, there was a lot of speculation floating around in the airline world. A fully blown accident investigation normally takes several years to complete, and even the interim report, which covers just the bare basic outline of the accident, can take several months before it's released. This means that the involved parties, the airline, aviation authorities and the aircraft manufacturer, have some room to form a public narrative around the accident with the help of the press, who naturally always wants answers straight away about what could have possibly happened. Boeing, who had back then just released the Boeing 737 MAX to the market, was therefore very proactive during those early weeks. Already on the 6th of November, a week after the accident, Boeing issued a flight crew operations bulletin aimed at clarifying what to do in case the stabilizer trim would suddenly and uncommanded start to trim nose down. It explained that this nose down trim could be activated by, for example, a malfunctioning angle of attack sensor, and the trimming could then last for as long as 10 seconds. This bulletin was sent out to all airlines who operated the type, and it highlighted in bold that this failure could only happen during manual flight. It then went further and explained that this trim movement could be stopped and reversed using normal electric trim inputs, and that if the failure who caused the trim persisted, well then the same thing could not happen again, 5 seconds after the last pilot trim input, until the stabilizer trim cutout switches were both moved to cutout as part of the existing memory items for a runaway stabilizer. Now, this bulletin is going to be extremely important for this story, so I want to again draw your attention to the wording in it. An angle of attack failure condition that can occur during manual flight only, and that could be solved using the runaway stabilizer normal checklist. Around the time this bulletin was released, information from the ongoing Lion Air investigation also came into the public domain, and it pointed to several mistakes having been made by the operating crew. It also showed that another crew had managed to land the aircraft safely on the preceding day with exactly the same fault. All of this quickly led to a narrative in the press that the crash had been caused largely by pilot error and poor maintenance, and that it therefore wasn't anything really fundamentally wrong with the 737 MAX design. Basically, the consensus was that if these pilots had just been better trained and had followed the existing non-normal checklist, they would have been able to solve the problem. Obviously, this was a gross simplification of the truth, and actually a perfect example of why speculation at an early stage after an accident can be really harmful. But this narrative likely suited Boeing just fine. Pilot error is an excellent overarching diagnosis, and to be fair to the Boeing team here, this was also what most professional pilots thought at the time, including me. Without understanding all the details of what had actually happened in that cockpit, it did seem strange that the pilots hadn't just executed the runaway stabilizer memory items when the aircraft was clearly trimming forward against their will. And as several articles from that time also pointed out, this was Boeing's initial public position as well. But in the background, a lot of pilots and pilot unions were starting to ask some quite hard questions to Boeing. How came this powerful MCAS system had been included in the aircraft design without being highlighted in the pilot manuals? Now, before I go any further here, I realize that maybe not all of you have seen my video about the first MAX accident, so I will now give a short systems review to make sure that this video makes proper sense. The Boeing 737 MAX had been created as a reaction to Airbus's A320neo family that had been fitted with larger and vastly more efficient engines. But the problem for Boeing was that the 737 sat much lower down closer to the ground and was therefore much harder to equip with similar larger engines. Now, some of you might ask, why not make the landing gear just a little bit taller? And that's a good question. In fact, the biggest versions of the MAX actually do have a slightly taller gear, but the technical difficulty in achieving that while still making them fit in the same wheel well bay was extremely high. And on top of that, the Boeing 737 family is also certified with overwing emergency exits without slides since it's sitting so close to the ground. So it just simply can't be made much higher without some further serious changes to the design. Instead, Boeing's engineers had solved this issue by fitting the larger CFM LEAP 1 Bravo engines more in front and slightly higher up than on the previous version, the 737NG. But that then caused some new problems. It soon turned out that these larger engines with their slightly flattened cowlings could, under certain circumstances, start producing a tiny bit of lift, which would act around the aircraft's pitch axis. So, if it was flown at high angles of attack, this momentum then meant that the MAX wouldn't behave exactly like the old NG had done, and that just wasn't okay. To counteract this, the Boeing engineers had added a software program to the existing speed trim system of the MAX, which would only, during those very specific circumstances where the aircraft was flown with a high angle of attack manually and with the flaps up, start trimming the horizontal stabilizer in a nose-down direction for a while. That would counteract the nose-up momentum from the engines and basically simulate the feel of the older 737. Just enough to allow the pilots of that previous variant to fly the MAX without any simulator training. The problem was, though, that during the development of the MAX, Boeing had made several assumptions about how pilots would react to this new system if it would malfunction and start trimming forward erroneously. The engineers had assumed that the pilots would instinctively feel that the aircraft was getting out of trim and therefore react within approximately 3 seconds by pulling back on their yoke to keep the aircraft level. They would then quickly activate opposite trim using their manual trim switches, effectively cancelling out the effect of the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS. On top of that, it was also assumed that if the failure that had caused MCAS to activate would still persist, well then the pilots would recognize that the stabilizer was acting strangely and therefore go through the memory items for a runaway stabilizer, which would stop the system from trimming any further. Now, all of this sounded good in theory, and if the pilots indeed did react this way, well, then the threat evaluation of the system would categorize it as major, which wasn't so bad and therefore allowed it to only depend on one single sensor. And that categorization would also mean that Boeing wasn't required to do what's called a fault tree analysis, which is a deeper study of how this particular fault could be combined with other failures and how that could potentially affect the crew. This is really key to understand because it actually explains how this system and its functionality managed to slip through the cracks of both Boeing and the FAA. And in order to fully understand this, I had to research loads of different US articles that were released around this time. Now the problem is that I am in Europe and several of those articles were geo-blocked to the US. But since I'm using NordVPN, today's sponsor, the solution to that problem was just a push of a button away. Nord allows me to travel virtually everywhere I want, which is awesome especially for heavy research like this, but also for watching sports events, finding great prices on travel and much more. It's especially handy when you're out traveling and want to encrypt your connection when you're using dodgy Wi-Fis at hotels, restaurants and bars, but Nord is actually so much more than that, with loads of added powerful cybersecurity tools like ad blockers, pre-scanning files for malware and more. Right now, Nord is offering an exclusive deal for my viewers, which gives you 4 extra months for free when you're signing up for the 2-year deal. And you have absolutely nothing to lose since Nord always gives you a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you, Nord, for helping us make these videos possible. Now, where was I? Ah yes, MCAS. During the MAX development, the authority that MCAS had over the horizontal stabilizer had also been gradually increased based on feedback from Boeing's test pilots. But that fact had not been properly communicated or understood by the FAA, who were actually in charge of the certification. So what this all meant was that this had led to a system that was now very powerful when not handled correctly, and also not known by a majority of the pilots who were operating the aircraft, since it hadn't been included in any of their manuals. On top of that, it also turned out that if MCAS was erroneously activated by a failure in an angle of attack vane, those little wing-looking probes on the side of the aircraft who measure the aircraft's angle against the oncoming air, well then its activation would be combined with a whole host of other failures that could distract the pilots from dealing with MCAS, which basically made the assumption of how pilots would react to the failure null and void. But like I said, no one fully understood this after the Lion Air accident, although some pilots did have some serious questions for Boeing. And one of those was a very senior management pilot in Ethiopian Airlines, another early MAX customer. After having attended a Boeing virtual briefing about MCAS in November of 2018, he sent an email to his Boeing representative with a couple of very relevant questions. And because they are so relevant regarding what was soon about to happen, I will now read them out for you. His first question was, according to the briefing, there was no problem with the MCAS system at the time of the accident except being triggered at the wrong moment during the flight due to a single erroneous angle of attack data. But then, why is the system designed in such a way that it operates depending on a single data source, especially when it's such serious consequences, instead of interrogating data from other angle of attack sensors? He then followed up with, any average skilled pilots experiencing multiple failures, as in this case, would react to the abnormalities depending on their sequence of urgency, starting with the stick shaker. Now, all simulator training so far provided require at the first activation of a stick shaker to react in such a way to curb the impending actual stall. It is, though, obvious that all stall warnings are not true, as was the case with the Lion Air 737 MAX involved in the accident. But once a pilot identified a stick shaker to be a nuisance, the next thing that he would do is the airspeed unreliable memory items, not the runaway stabilizer checklist. Because the airspeed unreliable checklist puts a nuisance stick shaker to be an indication of unreliable airspeed. A pilot just can't be expected to put the trim cutout switches to cutout before dealing with the above procedures, unless there is a clear guidance or a quick reference handbook procedure addressing such a scenario. And then finally he said, the third question has to do with the very checklist recommended by the bulletin issued regarding the MCAS system, and that is the runway stabilizer checklist. This checklist commands the pilot to put the stab trim cutout switches to cutout only if the runway continues after the autopilot is disconnected, and that is not the case with MCAS. MCAS does not continually trim down, it stops trimming, according to the bulletin, for 5 seconds if the control column trim switches are trimmed in the opposite direction. And that will rule out the attempt to categorize the malfunction as a runway stabilizer, and by implication the use of that checklist. So what is the delineation between an MCAS normal operation and the runway stabilizer? Now, as you can see, these are all very valid questions from a pilot who was concerned about instructing his colleagues in a correct way. Especially his third question, that highlighted that MCAS did not act like a runway stabilizer as described in the QRH, was extremely important. So, what do you think Boeing answered him? Well, according to the New York Times at the time, this email sent off a flurry of internal discussions at Boeing about what they could and couldn't say, since the Lion Air accident was still under investigation. In the answer that was finally sent back, Boeing completely declined to answer the first 2 questions, citing the ongoing investigation. And in the answer to the third, they basically reiterated the information from the crew bulletin that had already been sent out a couple of weeks earlier, saying that in all phases of manual flight, it is expected that flight crews would use normal trim procedures to trim out undesired control forces. Now, I will leave it up to you to decide if that answer was helpful or not, and we can, of course, never really know if better guidance here would have had any impact on what was soon about to happen. But I can tell you one thing, and that is that the investigators of the final report certainly thought so. Now, I will get to the actual flight very soon, but another thing that I haven't talked about much was the type of training that was offered to the pilots who were going to fly the MAX. A big part of Boeing's commercial strategy around this new variant was that existing 737 customers were supposed to be able to transition their pilots onto the MAX without any simulator training at all. You see, scheduling pilots for simulator training, even if it's just for a few hours, is a logistical nightmare that requires taking them off the roster, transporting them to a simulator center, and sometimes also provide hotels and meals for them. And since the Airbus pilots could just go straight into the Neo family after having just some theoretical training, this was what Boeing's commercial department now wanted to do with the MAX as well. Several internal Boeing emails shows that this strategy was considered super important. So important, it seems, that it superseded some airlines' direct requests to provide simulator training for their pilots, as that could create dangerous precedents for other airlines and aviation authorities to follow. This meant that the original difference training that the pilots received only included a few hours of self-study using computer-based training, CBT, basically a few hours on an iPad, where MCAS and its functions was not even mentioned. But at least Boeing had released that flight crew operational bulletin back in November of 2018, so now everyone operating the MAX knew about these possible trim problems, and that the runaway stabilizer memory items together with some easy opposite trimming would solve the problem. Right? Well, this brings us to Addis Ababa Bole International Airport in Ethiopia in the morning of the 10th of March 2019. This was shaping up to be a very nice day, with only some few clouds, light northeasterly winds and a temperature of about 13 degrees Celsius. The pilots who were scheduled to operate Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 arrived at the airport well in advance and started going through the pre-flight paperwork just like on any other day. The flight was going to take them down towards Nairobi in Kenya, and apart from the two pilots, there were also 5 cabin crew and 1 in-flight safety officer scheduled for it. The weather and NOTAMs along the route looked fine, so after having requested the final fuel, the pilots did what they always did. They walked over to the cabin crew and briefed them about what they could expect from the day, as well as any special requests that they might have. In charge of the flight was a 29-year-old captain, who at the time was actually the youngest captain in the airline. Despite his age, he had accumulated over 8,100 hours of total time, of which little more than 4,000 had been flown on the 737NG, as well as 103 hours on the MAX. His training record was very good, with only nice feedback from his trainers and colleagues. A stellar pilot, in other words, which was likely how he had managed to become a captain at such a relatively young age. Together with him was a 25-year-old first officer, but he was significantly less experienced. He had graduated from Ethiopian Airlines' own training academy during the previous year and had only been released to fly on the line in December of 2018, 3 months before the flight. That meant that he only had a little over 360 hours of total experience, with the vast majority of those, 207 hours, having been flown on the MAX, and all of those hours within the previous 90 days. Now, I know that some of my American audience will balk at that low experience, but this is actually quite common in Europe and Africa, especially if the pilots have been brought up through the airline's own approved flight training programs. The first officer's training history also indicated that he had been doing well so far, with no adverse training comments noted at all. Now, we know that both of these pilots had read the Boeing bulletin that had been issued after the Lion Air crash, and we know that because Ethiopian Airlines had sent out the bulletin to all of their pilots and had then been able to track that everyone had read it through their IT systems. You see, Ethiopian was, and still is, a highly advanced and well-regarded airline with a good safety rating and great reputation for their crew training, maintenance and overall quality, which is something that email that I showed you before from one of their management pilots also seems to confirm. This is actually good to remember, as it goes against some of the rhetoric that was floating around during the time concerning the involved airlines. Anyway, When the briefing was complete, the crew all walked together out towards the aircraft that was waiting for them out on the apron. It was an almost brand new Boeing 737 MAX 8, which on this day had only been flying for about 4 months, meaning that it only had 1,330 hours on the airframe. It had no outstanding technical issues with it, except that the captain's iPad charger outlet wasn't working properly. But as it turns out, its first 4 months had not been without issues. Back in December, some pilots had reported that they had observed temporary erratic fluctuations of their altitude and vertical speed indications, and that the aircraft had also started rolling for no reason when the autopilot was engaged. This had then been investigated thoroughly by Ethiopia's engineering department, but since these had been temporary and transient issues, it was unclear if they had been able to completely rectify the faults. In any case, those problems had not reappeared, but other issues like that problem with the power outlet on the captain's side, as well as a starter problem with the APU, had appeared only 3 days before the flight. Now, except for the iPad charger, these had then all been fixed, but it showed that maybe this aircraft had some electrical gremlins still lurking around after its delivery. In any case, none of the pilots who had actually operated the aircraft during the previous day had experienced any issues, so the tech log was therefore reasonably clean. As the crew were boarding, the pilots decided that the captain was going to be operating as pilot flying for the first flight of the day, and the first officer was therefore going to be pilot monitoring. So the captain started by checking out the tech log and then started setting up the aircraft, whilst the first officer went outside to complete the walk around. We don't know much about the pre-flight, except that once the 149 passengers had boarded, there were a total of 157 people on board, and the aircraft's weight and balance was well within limits. On top of that, the pilots had also calculated that the trim setting for takeoff should be 5.6 units, which would be important, and had also decided to use full takeoff thrust with flaps 5 selected. The reason they needed full thrust was because Addis Ababa Airport is situated quite high up, at an altitude of 7,656 feet. And the higher up you are, the less thrust the engines will be able to produce, so in this case they needed all of the thrust that they could get out of them. Anyway, the cockpit voice recorder transcript from the final report didn't include the pre-flight setup, so we don't know exactly what was said, but as it turns out, that won't really matter for this story anyway. What we do know is that around time 08:25 local time, everything was ready for push and start, so the first officer called up the ground controller and received clearance to proceed. The 2 Leap 1 Bravo engines were then started normally, and soon the aircraft was taxiing out towards the holding point for runway 07 right. The before takeoff checklist was then executed as per standard operating procedures, and at time 08:36 and 12 seconds, the pilots received clearance from Addis Ababa Tower to line up and wait on runway 07 right. At this point, there were no warnings recorded in the cockpit and nothing looked out of the ordinary. But that was soon about to change. Now, before we get into the takeoff sequence, I just want to take a few minutes here to explain a few things about the auto-throttle system and the way that it normally works during takeoff. We pilots first typically arm the auto-throttle when we are clear to line up on the runway as part of the before takeoff checklist. And once the master switch is armed, it will be ready for when the pilot flying pushes the toga buttons, which will then activate the auto-throttle servos and drive the thrust up into the takeoff N1 setting. The pilot monitoring will then verify that this setting is correct and normally also call that out, so that both pilots are aware that the system is working normally. As the speed then accelerates past 84 knots, the auto throttle will go into a mode known as throttle hold, which disengages the servos and just keeps the thrust levels where they are. The pilots can still move them manually, but this mode is there to make sure that no sudden retard failure happens during that critical phase of the takeoff. The auto throttle will then keep this mode until the aircraft passes 800 feet climbing, where it will switch over to a mode called ARM instead, which is very similar to throttle hold, except that system will now also provide underspeed protection, which might add thrust if a low speed situation is sensed. But if not, the thrust just stays where it is. The next thing that is supposed to happen is an automatic thrust reduction back to climb thrust, and the altitude for that can be selected manually by the pilots, but it normally kicks in when the aircraft reaches 1,500 feet above the airport level, as sensed from the captain's altimeter. During all normal operations, the auto throttle always handles the thrust for the pilots during the takeoff, meaning that the pilots won't normally have to interfere with the thrust levels much during that phase, and that's worth keeping in mind. Now, while we're on the subject of automatic systems, I should also mention a protection system in the Autopilot known as minimum speed reversion. During climb and descent in most vertical modes, this system will cause the autopilot to revert back to level change if the speed drops to less than 1.3 times the calculated stall speed. Level change will then pitch the nose down to maintain that minimum speed, and that stall speed is calculated with the help of the angle of attack vanes. So that, finally, brings us back to the start of runway 07 right in Addis Ababa. At time 08:37 and 14 seconds, the aircraft had fully lined up and the first officer reported to the tower that they were ready for departure. The tower told them to temporarily stand by, but 12 seconds later, Flight 302 were cleared for takeoff and also to follow the Shala 2 Alpha departure as previously cleared. The first officer read this back at the same time as the captain moved the thrust levels up to 40% N1 and then called stable. He then pushed the toga buttons, which caused the engines to roar into takeoff thrust, and the first officer responded, "Check, N1, toga," whilst the aircraft started accelerating down the runway. As the takeoff continued, the first officer verified that the thrust was properly set and then called this out, which was cross-checked by the captain. Everything normal so far. When the aircraft accelerated past 80 knots, the first officer called this out together with throttle hold, indicating that the auto throttle system was now working exactly as expected, and 18 seconds later, the automatic V1 call could be heard, followed by the first officer calling rotate, and 8 seconds later, positive rate, indicating that the aircraft was now airborne and that the gear could be safely retracted. The captain therefore called for gear up, which the first officer acknowledged and moved the tiny gear level up. But this was about as far as they got using normal procedures. Because on the left-hand side of the aircraft, something had now happened. We don't know exactly what. Maybe it was a bird strike, or maybe it was just a sudden fault that occurred in the wiring of the captain's angle of attack sensor, but we do know that as the gear came up, the master caution light suddenly illuminated, showing anti-ice on the first officer's panel and a left alpha vane on the overhead panel. But the first officer only had time to call out, "Master caution, anti-ice," before the pandemonium really started. You see, whatever had caused the heating element in the left angle of attack vane to malfunction had now also affected the values that this vane was transmitting into the aircraft's left air data module and air data inertial reference unit. Initially, that indication decreased slightly before suddenly going violently up to a value of 74.5 degrees, which was to be compared to the 15.3 degrees of the right angle of attack vane. The left ADIRU immediately interpreted this as a massive increase of the angle of attack and therefore a potential stall. The red and black Barber's poles therefore shut up on the captain's primary flight display, and the stick shaker also activated, causing a huge noise in the cockpit and an immediate startle effect for the pilots. Because of these faulty signals from the left vane, the left ADIRU now also started correcting the speed and altitude on the captain's display, which were now showing lower values than those on the first officer's side. Now that should have led to altitude and IAS disagree warnings on the pilot's displays, but curiously those warnings were not sensed on the flight data recorder, nor were they ever called out by the crew. It is possible that these warnings did appear, but that they just were missed by the pilots who were busy checking the master caution. You see, we humans are quite good at registering changes in front of us, like a warning popping up on a screen, but we're much worse at noticing a change to a scene that has happened while we were looking somewhere else. That's why most of you didn't notice that the background lighting here in my office has now switched from white to blue, or that my cup is different. In any case, the captain now, likely in response to the stick shaker, lowered his pitch from the standard 15 degrees to around 8 degrees instead, and he also trimmed the aircraft out for this new attitude. Now, the immediate response to a stall warning should be to execute the approach to stall escape maneuver, but given the fact that the stick shaker only activated on the left-hand side and that his indicated speed was fine for the attitude that he was now flying, even though it was inside of the Barber's poles, This response by the captain to just pitch down slightly would have been fully logical. The corrupted angle of attack values now also started affecting the flight director system, whose pitch bars now temporarily disappeared out of view. They would then come back and disappear several times over the coming few minutes. Now, according to the Ethiopian standard operating procedures, the autopilot could be engaged as early as 400 feet above ground, but that should obviously not be done if a stall could be suspected. But even though the stick shaker was still active here, the captain now twice tried to engage the autopilot whilst calling out "Command!" But in response, he only got the disconnect warning, possibly because he was still inputting a bit of force on his controls, and he also soon called out "What's going on?" in frustration. So why was he so desperately trying to get the autopilot in here? Well, we can't know for sure. Maybe he just wanted to reduce the workload and get a better overview of the situation, but there is also a possibility that he had recognized the signs of an angle of attack malfunction. And do you remember what the recent Boeing bulletin had said about that? Yes, the wording was, Boeing would like to call attention to an angle of attack failure condition that can occur during manual flight only, written in bold. So there is a small chance that he thought that engaging the autopilot could potentially solve the problem. This is why it's so important to formulate these type of documents carefully. Anyway, as the aircraft continued climbing through 400 feet, the flight director suddenly came back again and both the LNAV and VNAV buttons illuminated. The captain continued flying manually, keeping the aircraft in trim using his electric trim switches, and he now asked the first officer to contact the controller, which the first officer also did. He reported that they were following the Shala 2 Alpha departure, crossing 8,400 feet, remember that's only 750 feet above ground, and that they were climbing to flight level 320. But they didn't yet mention anything about the problems that they were experiencing. The indicated altitude on the first officer's side was indeed 8,400 feet here, but on the captain's side it was indicating about 400 feet lower. Remember, that's the altitude that the auto throttle system was taking its cues from. Someone, likely the captain, now selected heading select instead of LNAV as a roll mode, with the runway heading of 072 degrees still set in the MCP. This is consistent with most failure management techniques, which includes flying straight ahead in case of a major malfunction rather than following the standard instrument departure. Doing that should hopefully reduce workload significantly and help the pilots focus on aviating, navigating and communicating, which are the only really important things in situations like this. The auto throttle engaged in arm as the captain's altimeter climbed through 800 feet as per design, and when they passed 1,000 feet, the captain finally managed to engage the autopilot, which started following the heading selected as well as VNAV in pitch. But that didn't last for very long. Remember what I told you about the minimum speed reversions and how the autopilot would react if an impending stall was sensed? Well, since the left angle of attack vane was now feeding faulty values into the stall management yaw damper computer, it thought that the left speed was way too low and computed that a safe speed would therefore be much higher, somewhere above the barber's poles. This caused the autopilot to now revert to level change and start pitching down in order to quickly achieve this clearly faulty higher speed, and that also meant that the autopilot started trimming forward. This part is very different than what had happened on the Lion Air flight, but it was all caused by exactly the same type of fault. And if you saw that video, you also now know that this was about to get way, way worse. At times 08:39 and 30 seconds, the radar controller identified flight 302 on his radar and told them to climb to flight level 340 and to turn right to Rudolph when able. The first officer read this back, and as that was going on, there were several small roll and heading oscillations indicated on the flight data recorder. This was likely because the yaw damper had now also been affected by the faulty vane, which resulted in smaller yaw damper activations as per design close to a stall. But it's not sure that this was noticed by the crew, who definitely had more pressing things to worry about. At this point, they still hadn't mentioned anything about any IS or altitude disagree, and the flight data recorder also still didn't indicate that these warnings were actually displayed. But in any case, a stick shaker activation on one side together with a crazy barber pole indication on the captain's PFD could definitely be interpreted as flight with unreliable airspeed. But this was never verbalized, and I kind of understand why. You see, the captain now found himself in a situation where he needed to try and make sense of a stick shaker, possible unreliable airspeed, and an autopilot who wasn't behaving as it was supposed to. Everything at the same time and still during the very early takeoff phase. This was exactly the kind of situation where that guidance on how to prioritize multiple failures caused by a faulty angle of attack vane would have come in very handy. But as I'm sure you remember, that had not been provided. In any case, the captain now pressed level change and selected 238 knots on the mode control panel. Since the speed had already accelerated above the minimum retraction speeds, he now also asked the first officer to start retracting the flaps, which he also did. And the captain then started turning the heading bog towards the right onto a heading of 197 degrees, probably to try and follow the clearance that they had just been given. But he then seemed to change his mind. He asked the first officer to tell the controller that they were unable and to request if they could instead continue on runway heading. Again, a very smart thing to do. But the first officer didn't immediately respond to that request. Maybe because of the high noise level caused by the stick shaker and the quickly increasing airspeed. We don't know. Instead, about 4 seconds later, the autopilot suddenly disconnected. So why did that happen then? Well, the autopilot continuously runs a self-diagnosis, and if the command is for it to climb, but it doesn't do that for a certain amount of time, well then it will just disconnect itself. And since it was still sensing an incorrect low-speed situation, it had once again gone into a speed reversion, trying to gain more speed, and had therefore stopped climbing. During this phase, the aircraft reached an altitude of 9,100 feet, or about 1,450 feet above ground, and they now slowly started descending, with the flaps retracted and takeoff thrust still set, but at the same time the left stick shaker was also still rattling away and the speed was increasing rapidly. Because of the low speed reversion, the autopilot had also trimmed the nose down to about 4.6 units before it disengaged, so when the captain now had to take back manual control again, the nose would have already been quite heavy. And now, since the aircraft was flown manually with flaps up and with a sensed high angle of attack, all of the engagement criteria for MCAS had also been fulfilled. So the trim suddenly started running forward at high speed for the next 9 seconds. And as that was happening, the captain was busy with again asking the first officer to request to maintain runway heading and to tell the controller that they had flight control problems. When he finished that sentence, the first ground proximity warning system activation came, calling out "Don't sink," as it felt that the aircraft was now descending during the departure sequence. The first officer now finally did as he was told and called up the controller, telling him that they were unable to continue on the departure. The captain then reminded him to also ask for runway heading, which he did. Ahead of both pilots on their primary flight display, a red pull-up message now also appeared, connected to the GPWS "Don't Sink" oral warning. So you can maybe see now how the situation was getting more and more overwhelming and confusing for the pilots. Since MCAS was allowed to run this first activation to its full extent, it finished with a stabilizer setting of 2.1 units, which is a super low setting. The captain was still holding the nose just barely above the horizon, but to do that he needed to pull with a force of 90 pounds or about 41 kilos. This would have taken his full two-hand effort, and he now started trimming back to try and reduce the force, but he only did so for about 2 seconds. Now here it's probably worth mentioning another feature of MCAS that I haven't pointed out before. You see, because it had been implemented to quickly input trim in order to augment the stick force, MCAS ran the trim at a very high speed, the same speed as the manual electric trim would move with it if the flaps was extended. But since the flaps were now retracted, the manual trim speed had reduced to a much slower pace, which meant that when the captain now trimmed in the other direction, it didn't move the trim nearly as much as MCAS had. On top of that, MCAS had been allowed to activate for 9 full seconds, whilst the captain only held his switch down for about 2 seconds. What this all meant was that when the captain released his trim switch, the trim setting had only risen to about 2.3 units, which was nearly no change at all. But because he had activated the trim, MCAS had now been reset and was therefore ready to activate again. So why didn't the captain stop MCAS when it started, and why didn't he trim all the way back as Boeing had predicted that the pilots would do when they designed the system? Well, we can obviously never know that for sure, but you have to understand the situation that these two pilots now found themselves in here. When Boeing had designed this system, they had assumed a pilot reaction within 3 seconds, but that was when no other problems were present. This crew had a continuous stick shaker, erroneous and differing speed and altitude information, an autopilot that had just disconnected by itself in an already mistrimmed situation, and GPWS activation, all at the same time. It is likely that the startle of the autopilot disengaging with the aircraft descending caused the captain to lose a few seconds as he took over the controls. And MCAS was then continuously trimming forward already, so his immediate reaction would have been to try and hold against the pitch down and to find an equilibrium. And whilst doing that, he simply just didn't trim. The force that he then had to input obviously kept getting worse and increasing as the trim changed, so finding the correct pitch would have been exceedingly hard, and he would have never felt these kind of forces in the controls before, not even in the simulator. Now, the fact that he didn't trim back more once he started is harder to explain, but maybe he felt like it wasn't doing much and instead tried to come up with a more permanent solution. The controller now came back and approved them to continue straight ahead, whilst the captain called out "flaps up speed" at the same time as MCAS activated again, still with the GPWS system calling out "don't sink" in the background. The captain now managed with all of his strength to keep the pitch above the horizon and even to climb a bit, which meant that the aircraft actually managed to reach 1,500 feet above the ground. And if you remember, this is where the auto throttle should have reduced back to climb thrust, but because the faulty angle of attack vane was still sending crazy signals, the captain's altitude now read almost 1,000 feet lower. So the auto throttle just stayed in arm with takeoff thrust still set. Their speed was now around 332 knots, still increasing and also still indicating a stall on the left-hand side. The aircraft had a pitch of around 2.5 degrees and was also still rolling softly from side to side when the crew finally came up with a plan to solve the situation. The captain first called for the first officer to help him trim with me, and he also activated the manual electric trim, which now stopped the second MCAS activation. This was then followed by a manual trim up for about 9 full seconds, but because the manual trim was so slow, it only got the trim setting back to where they had started, at 2.3 units. The first officer now suggested stab trim cutout, which formed part of the runaway stabilizer memory items and was the guidance that Boeing had provided in order to solve the situation. The captain responded in a strained voice, "Yes, do it!" and the first officer immediately did. This meant that the trim wheels now finally stopped moving, but it didn't actually help the situation that they were already in. The trim setting was now way too low, and the captain was still pulling with over 90 pounds just to keep the nose above the horizon. Now, activating the stabilizer trim cutout switches did indeed stop MCAS. The flight data recorder sensed an MCAS activation at this time without the trim moving, but it also removed the pilot's primary way of trimming away the horrible force that the captain was still fighting. According to the runaway stabilizer non-normal checklist, the aircraft can be trimmed manually using the manual trim handles on the trim wheels, but we will soon see that this came with its own unique problems. From time 0840 and 44 seconds, the captain called for the first officer to help him pull up, which the first officer also did, and he also asked him to call the controller and advise him of their flight control problems and to ask if they could maintain 14,000 feet for now, as they were trying to solve their issues. The controller quickly approved this and asked for their intentions, but the first officer just told him that they would call him back. Again, the right thing to do here. The flight path during this time was erratic, with the aircraft pitching up with almost 7 degrees when both pilots were pulling on the controls, causing a climb with around 4,400 feet per minute. and then pitching down with about -2 degrees when the first officer did something else, causing a descent with 2,500 feet per minute. 14,000 feet was now set in the mode control panel, and soon after that the overspeed clacker activated, which triggered the captain to call out speed, which the first officer also read back. The aircraft had now exceeded the maximum certified indicated airspeed of 340 knots, but still none of the pilots reduced the thrust, which can maybe seem a little bit strange. But you have to remember that at this point, both of the pilots were likely pulling with almost their entire full force on the yoke just to try and keep the nose above the horizon. The faster the speed became, the more effective the stabilizer would have been, and the more force would have been needed in order to keep the nose up. And on top of that, bringing the thrust back would have also caused a further pitch down momentum, since the engines were mounted under the wings, and therefore the thrust actually helped keep the nose up. In any case, the captain, now with more and more desperation in his voice, called out, "Trim, is it functional?" And the first officer responded, "It is not working. Should I try manual?" To which the captain burst out, "Try it!" But here we come to a truly diabolical detail. Like I said before, the stabilizer was now being subjected to truly extreme aerodynamic forces. And in order for the first officer to move it, he would now need to use muscle power to force the trim wheel to turn with the use of trim handles on his and possibly also the captain's trim wheel. This movement would then transfer through cables to the back, where it would start turning the jack screw to activate the stabilizer and move its leading edge downwards. But at the same time, the captain was pulling back on his control column, which deflected the elevators on the back of the stabilizer upwards. This created a huge momentum around the stabilizer's pivot point, holding against the direction that the first officer needed to trim it. So as the first officer now folded out the trim handle and started to pull with all of his might, the trim wheel likely didn't move an inch. It would have seemed like it was completely frozen. This effect was not something that was taught in any simulator, and it wasn't even properly highlighted in the pilot's flight crew training manual. It turns out that there was actually a way to alleviate this issue, referred to as the roller coaster maneuver, where the pilot flying could momentarily release the back pressure on the controls, which would then take away the aerodynamic momentum for a short while, during which trimming would be possible. And the pilot flying would then be able to pull again, only to repeat the maneuver later, hence the roller coaster bit. But this maneuver was only described in the manuals for the older 737-200s and not anywhere else. And in any case, the likelihood of these panicked pilots figuring this out and at an altitude of 1,500 feet above the ground be willing to let the aircraft pitch down was completely out of the question. I actually tried a similar scenario in a 737NG simulator back in 2019, and even though its forces were not calibrated to exactly simulate the same conditions, we had absolutely no chance to move the trim, and I actually had to ask the instructor to freeze the sim before I lost control. It was pretty scary, even in a sim. Johan, press the red button. Press the red button now. And on top of all of that, I should also mention that for this crew to be able to fully trim out the forces that they were feeling, the first officer would have needed to turn the trim wheel not just once, but around 40 full rotations, as each trim unit requires around 15 turns. So, faced with what he perceived as a stuck trim wheel, the first officer now called out, "It's not working!" And the captain responded, "Okay, keep with me," likely referring to helping him out with the pitch. He then repeated that phrase several times over. Around here you can clearly hear strained sounds from the pilots as they were fighting to keep the nose up, and the captain reiterated that they needed to get the aircraft up to 14,000 feet. He now told the first officer to ask for vectors back towards the airport, which the first officer also did. The controller responded and asked them to confirm that they wanted to come back and land, and here you can hear the captain calling out, "Stand by, stand by, stand by," in the background. The first officer responded, "Standing by," to the controller, who then gave them a heading of 260 degrees to follow. The first officer then confirmed this and put it into the mode control panel, followed by another request from the captain to help him to keep the nose up. It is very likely that every time that the first officer did anything else than pulling, the nose was now pitching down. A few seconds later, the captain called out, 14,000, okay, what is it? Master caution? In an apparent attempt to do some troubleshooting here, something that they didn't really have had time to do until this point. Remember, this was only 4 minutes into this flight. The first officer asked, Master caution, pressed the recall panel and then continued with Master caution, anti-ice, and then the captain filled in with left alpha vane, which the first officer confirmed, showing that this was likely indeed what was causing the problems. In the background, the stick shaker and clacker were both still sounding, together with a very loud sound of air rushing past the windshield at extreme speeds. The troubleshooting didn't go any further than this. Instead, the captain started calling out, "Shall we pitch? Pitch is not enough! Pitch is not enough!" And then he said, "Put them up." What he was referring to here was the stabilizer trim cutout switches, which had been deactivated earlier as part of the runaway stabilizer memory items. So why would he ask for them to be put back up again when they were the only thing stopping MCAS from reactivating? Well, we can't know this for sure, but I think that the answer is as obvious as it is heartbreaking. With the current trim setting that they were experiencing and the speed that they were at, the pilots were simply unable to keep the nose up any longer. And the captain knew that before those switches had been activated, at least his electrical trim had been working. So he likely reasoned that it was worth it to activate them again and then maybe be able to trim out the forces or even get the autopilot engaged. So at times 08:43 and 11 seconds, the switches were moved back up, and this was then almost immediately followed by the autopilot disconnect wailer as the captain unsuccessfully tried to engage it. Seconds later, the trim switch was manually engaged and the trim started moving up 2 very short moments, but that was enough to again reset MCAS. 5 seconds later, the trim wheel started running forward and kept going for a total of 5 seconds, which drove the trim from 2.3 units down to 1. An impossible setting to counteract for these exhausted 2 pilots. The recorded force on the control wheel now temporarily decreased from 100 pounds or 45 kilos back to 75 pounds, and that immediately caused the nose to drop from 0.5 degrees to minus 7.8 degrees and a 5,000 feet per minute descent. The speed was now well over 380 knots, and despite the 2 pilots pulling for their lives with a combined force of 180 pounds or 83 kilos, the nose now just kept dropping further, with the GPWS calling out, "Terrain, terrain, pull up, pull up." The captain could be heard screaming, pitch up, mayday, mayday, mayday," until the very end. The last recording from the flight data recorder indicated a 40-degree nose-down attitude with a speed of 500 knots and a truly terrifying vertical speed of over 33,000 feet per minute. The aircraft eventually crashed at the time 08:43 and 44 seconds, 23 seconds after the last MCAS activation and less than 6 minutes after takeoff. The impact immediately killed all 157 people on board, and it created a crater over 10 meters deep in the Ethiopian farmland a few miles east of Addis Ababa airport. When the controller lost radar contact with the flight and also couldn't reach them on the radio, he soon initiated the emergency protocol, and the location of the crash site was then quickly found. News of this second Boeing 737 MAX crash spread quickly over the world and completely shocked the aviation community. I actually quite vividly remember where I was when I heard that this had happened. Anyway, the investigation soon got underway, and within days of retrieving the flight data and cockpit voice recorders, it became clear to the investigators that the accident was eerily similar to the earlier Lion Air crash, with the difference that in this case the crew had, at least for a while, followed Boeing's bulletin and used the stabilizer trim cutout switches. This caused the Ethiopian authorities on the 11th of March to immediately ground all Boeing 737 MAX aircraft, and that was then followed by the Chinese, Indonesian and European authorities doing the same on the 12th of March and then the FAA on the 13th, followed quickly by the rest of the world. The final report eventually came with 88 different findings and a whole host of different safety recommendations, but to summarize, the Boeing 737 MAX was found to have been certified with a system that was, and I quote my friend Björn here, like a tiger in a dark room. You could avoid it, but if it attacked you, it could be deadly. The FAA was found to have delegated too much of its responsibility to their ODA representatives, basically Boeing employees that was representatives of the FAA, and had therefore missed the risk that MCAS had posed. Boeing had obviously absolutely not intended for this to happen, but a combination of commercial pressure to get the aircraft to market and actions designed to avoid pilot training at almost any cost had ultimately allowed this system and its potency to slip between the cracks and to end up more powerful than intended, while also reliant on only one single sensor. But here is where we get to the silver lining of this story. Something that I feel have just been completely neglected by all of the press coverage and even by the Netflix documentary who also tried to explain this story. You see, Boeing and the FAA worked tirelessly over the coming 2 years to rectify every single detail of the 737 MAX that the investigations had highlighted. And when the aircraft was eventually released back into commercial service, MCAS was still there, but it had now become constrained into that little cat in a cage that it was always supposed to have been, not the tiger that it had become. It is also now mandatory for all pilots to do simulator training before they are allowed to operate the MAX, and this training includes how to deal with unreliable airspeed, runaway stabilizer, faulty stick shakers, as well as a detailed demonstration of MCAS. Now, my friend Ben and I have actually just created this difference course as an add-on to our virtual 737 course, which I'll link to here below, so check it out if you're curious. An MCAS itself is now also connected to 2 angle of attack vanes and can under any circumstance only activate once, never reset. If it actually has been activated, or if a fault in the system is sensed, it will then remain inoperative for the rest of the flight, and only that fact is clear proof that the MAX itself doesn't really need this system to fly safely. There were also numerous other improvements and upgrades added to the design, including the angle of attack disagree warning that I mentioned in the previous episode, and all in all, the MAX is, because of all of this, now likely one of the most thoroughly checked aircraft in history. Will there be other problems? Maybe, but I have flown this aircraft myself after it was recertified, and I was really impressed with it. And would I travel on it as a passenger now? Absolutely. Boeing also eventually admitted liability, and in 2021 they came to an agreement with the United States Department of Justice to pay around $2.5 billion in fines and compensations to the families of the victims, as well as to their airline customers. This ordeal shook the American aircraft manufacturer to its core, and the ripple effects of these 2 crashes are still affecting Boeing today. Which is something that I'm following closely over on my sister channel, Mentour Now, which you should definitely check out. Now, I hope that these 2 videos have made the story of the Boeing 737 MAX crashes more clear, and if you like the way that I have explained it, then please consider subscribing. You can also support my work and even see my next video before everyone else by joining my Patreon crew using the link here below. It is now possible to gift a membership, which might be a great idea if you know someone who enjoys my channel and might want to join my next Patreon Zoom hangout. Watch these 2 videos next, they're really good, and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye bye.